Prominent historian Dr. Sishua, thank you so much for agreeing to speak with me on this day.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for having me.
Let's start off with some recollection of some memories that you had with President Edgar Lungu. I remember vividly one of the viral moments that everyone was talking about was number one in 2023 when you met with President Edgar Lungu and he left a note for you. And allow me to just read the note that President Edgar Lungu left for you after that interaction that you had with him in 2023. It read, "It was a pleasure meeting you in person for the first time. I enjoyed our enlightening and thought-provoking conversation. In retrospect, we should have met much earlier. Maybe I could not have taken you for a hired gun. Otherwise, I read all your writings, although I had difficulties appreciating the motive for the reason I referred to. My interaction with you, however, revealed you are a principled critic. There are many lessons and will continue to learn and perfect. Best wishes, my brother, with your research. You are welcome anytime. Let's continue talking." Take us back to this moment, Dr. Sishua, when you met with President Edgar Lungu.
Thank you. I met him as part of my research, academic research that is into the outcome of the 2021 election. I requested for meeting with a number of people who were key participants in that election. It was, I thought, important to understand from his perspective why he lost the election, and I thought I could request an interview with him. Initially, he I had requested that, I had made that request several times. The answer that came back on those occasions was no, because he felt I was part of those who contributed to his loss of the election through constant criticism of his actions, leadership actions and policies. So I understood, his decision not to meet me in the initial years. But I got a breakthrough when I came to Zambia, I think for the Democracy Summit. I did give an interview to Al Jazeera, I think, and he watched that. And I was told by his handlers that he has been reading some of my commentaries, including the criticism of the current administration, and realized that perhaps I was not the hired gun that he thought I was. When I got the clearance to meet him, I proceeded to have the interview with him, but also to have to get him to hear, to rather to express himself in relation to how he felt. He was very open. He said, "Listen, you are very critical of my administration, and I thought you were sponsored by Hakainde Hichilema and the UPND in your actions." And he felt that is the kind of feedback that he got from the intelligence. And he mentioned that sometimes I think we are fed wrong information by the intelligence as well, because you don't know, by the time the information gets to you, you don't know what is true anymore. Sometimes the people around you tell you, stay away from this person because he's working with the opposition. But I think that he came to realize after Hichilema came to power, and I started highlighting some of the governance failures of Hichilema that Lungu himself was guilty of, that he noticed, as he said in that note, that it wasn't personal for me. It wasn't that I hated him as a person or the PF as a political party. It was because I believed a better country was possible, that we could treat each other better, we have respect for human rights and democracy, and that any leader who departs from these commitments should be held to account. And I did explain to him as well that my approach to governance issues is to hold those in power at a given time to account. Once they leave office, my attention shifts to the next set of leaders, holding a set of commitments that I think all of us as Zambians hold dear, including respect for human rights, a commitment to democracy, but also a commitment to improving the material conditions of Zambians. So he was, in that 2023 interview, he was very reflective, and as he said, look, I was wrong. I told him that, when you are president, for example, it will be very easy for you to find out if this person was truly sponsored by Hichilema or the UPN. You demand for evidence. Hichilema was in opposition for 15 years. During that 15 years, for example, I never even met Hichilema. Not that there were no requests to meet him. They were. I was very unhappy with how Hichilema was treated in opposition. And I did raise concerns about that against the Lungu administration. I would have raised those concerns even if it wasn't Hichilema on the receiving end of the ill treatment that was meted on him, not because I supported the UPND, or I supported PF, I supported Hichilema, or I supported Lungu, but because there were matters of principles for me. Commitments to governance should not be dictated by the leader who is in office at a given time. They should be dictated by whether or not that leader is respecting the principles of democracy and accountability. And if they are not, all of us as citizens have a duty to hold them to account. And Hichilema himself knows, he's alive. If he was sponsoring me, or if he even gave me a single way, he'll be the first one here, and he's supposed to be the first one to say, we sponsored Joshua to say this, here is the evidence. So we believe anybody else can do the same as we did. But he knows that that's not the case. And sometimes I hear people repeating the same mistakes that Lungu was pointing out in that note, that, this issue is a hired gun for the opposition. Sometimes they even go to the extent of saying, we support PF, we support Lungu. That's the Lungu administration, as you know, Andrew, wanted me arrested for my criticism of its actions. It had to take the support of international academics and local academics in Zambia, civil society, who raised concern to say, can you leave him alone? And also because I criticized Lungu, on a number of issues, including not because we were campaigning for Tongas or for Lozis, for Northwesterners, but because national unity demands that every Zambian must have the opportunity to feel that they have a fair chance, whether it comes to public appointments or to simply other opportunities. And now when I criticize the current administration, because what Hichilema is doing is the reverse of what Lungu was doing on that score, where you have Bemba and Easterners now on the receiving end of this kind of marginalization, the supporters of the ruling party turn around and say, you are a hired gun, or you are sponsored by this one. So I think there's a lesson there for leaders, for me to say, you see, a leader who is receptive to criticism, constructive criticism, succeeds, because it can't be that you, when I was criticizing Lungu for this kind of excesses, I was perceived as a good person by UPND and his supporters. When I raised the same concerns under the current administration, for example, then I'm now PF for supporter of Lungu. I think what is important is be loyal to principle. And I'm very happy that Lungu noticed that error and as he said in that note, felt that maybe if we had met earlier, we could have had a better relationship. There are two quick points there that I think have to be stated. The first is that you don't need to meet your critics to listen to what they are saying. If what Joshua is saying, what Andrew is saying makes sense, implement it, get the ideas and go and do the right thing. I don't need to meet you, Andrew. I don't need to meet my critics to listen to them. What is important is to pay attention to what is being said, not the source of who is speaking. Even if I don't like you, for example, the person, if what you are saying makes sense and is good for the country, I should actively listen to that and implement it. The second point, I think, is that we don't know the people that we think the truth about them. Our relationship will be different. Because what Lungu is acknowledging in that note is to say, what I thought about you was actually wrong. And maybe I should have treated you differently. And I think there are lessons there for the current leadership, not necessarily in relation to me. They can say whatever they want about me. I don't mind, if they feel that the best their mind can contribute in response to what I'm saying is to call me names. That's okay. I bear sympathies and special understanding for those among us whose only capacity to reason is never beyond an hominem attack. I suppose they can't help it, even if they try. But the key issue for me is that listen to other voices. The Oasis Forum just yesterday released a statement on the constitution making process. So can you abandon this thing? And there have been several other critics of this Bill 7. What do you have? You have leaders in the UPND who insist this is a good thing. Good thing for who? This is for the people. The people are telling you, the churches, the civil organizations, the individuals, the opposition are telling you, this thing is bad. Can you please step back? It's important for those in public office to listen to the people always, because see, what Lungu is acknowledging there is that when you listen, you could make different conclusions altogether. And I think that lesson is very important for the current leadership as well, the future leaders to reflect.
What would you say is the major difference with the Lungu that you met in 2023 and the Lungu that you knew as president? Did you see any difference?
I did. The Lungu that I met was reflective. He removed from the trappings of power. Our politicians seem to rediscover their principles. It's a constant theme. When they're in opposition, they are very, very attentive, actively listen. And when they're in power, they become something else. I don't know what happened to these people. I don't know whether it's the water they drink, or perhaps they just review their character. The Lungu that I met, it's prominent lawyers like John Sangwa, whether it's just ordinary people like myself, it was very, very dismissive. Everything that people said against the administration or Lungu's leadership was dismissed as wrong or sponsored by the opposition, or as a function of a result of bitterness or whatever attacks that they leveled. So they were not very receptive to criticism. The Lungu that I met was able to reflect and say, you know what, I could have done better there. When you are in that position of presidency, it's very, very easy to think, all is well, because you are surrounded by people who tell you mostly what you want to hear, but you are also, removed from the realities of everyday life, and sometimes you don't even read newspapers, or you don't listen to radio, and it's very important for leaders to reflect on public, criticism of their actions, and to be receptive to advice, even if it comes from the unlikely quarters. If each, for example, says something that is good for the country and is in opposition, the government should have the obligation to listen to that and consider those ideas. The Lungu I met was very cognizant of that point, but he didn't have power. The second point that when I met him in 2023, and even recently, one of the points that he mentioned was this idea that after he lost the 2021 election, there was enormous pressure from his supporters and those around him not to concede defeat. He said, wait, we are going to do something. We are going to go to court and petition the results. But in the end, he conceded defeat peacefully, and we had a smooth transition of power. Now, you see, it's very easy to take for granted that action on the part of Lungu, but it was a very, very important moment in our nation's history, because if he had gone to court, that is the constitutional court, this is the court that has consistently proved, both under Lungu and under the current administration, that they are pro-executive. It is likely that they could have ruled in his favor and nullified the election of Hakainde Hichilema, notwithstanding the margin to which he defeated Lungu. Now, to the extent that would have taken that a possibility, they could have invented any reason for doing so, what would have happened? Maybe people would have taken to the streets, maybe violence would have erupted, maybe our course of history would have changed. So you can see how important it is to have leaders who are able sometimes to go against those who surround them are saying, simply say, look, this is not good for the country. When I asked him why he ultimately decided against going for the election petition, his response was that even if I won the court case, for example, and ended up as president again, I would have lacked legitimacy. Now, that's a leader who is reflecting, who is putting the country first. It wasn't always the case that Lungu put Zambia first when he was in power. In fact, if I'm to sum Lungu's legacy, in a one line, I would say he was a bad president and a good former president, in the sense that after leaving office, I think the Lungu that we saw was one who was willing to fight for the country's democracy. He said when he came back, I'm going to fight for the country's democracy. He lost he lost the benefits that came with the former president as a result of the decision to come back to active politics. But it was a moment of sacrifice, because he could have easily continued enjoying life and away from the problems that he was facing. He came back. There are many other things that I suppose we are going to discuss as we go further. But the critical point is that the Lungu that was in opposition was one who was able to listen, to reflect. In a sense, actually reminds me of Hichilema when he was in opposition. When in opposition, Hichilema could actively listen. He talked less and listened more. The kind of arrogance that you see him now, most of the time when he's talking, he's dripping with arrogance. That wasn't there in opposition. The listening part was very, very good in opposition. When he comes to power, he suddenly knows it all. The arrogance of saying, for example, he say, no one will remove me from this seat, I'm already seated there. That's a disrespect to voters. You should be able to do your part as a leader and say, well, at the end of it all, I've done my best. If Zambians feel that what I've done is good enough for me to be re-elected, I'm sure they will do that. It's not for you to start saying, nobody will remove me from the seat. I don't know what happened to leaders when they assume the reins of power, because the humility that I saw Lungu outside State House with was lacking when he was in power. And I have funny memories for the fact that outside power, I thought he was able to reflect back on his presidency and to help me understand why he acted in a way that he did. When I met him recently, it was really in relation to the book that I'm writing on why presidents fail. No one gets elected, Andrew, on the promise of delivering failure.
And we'll be coming to that shortly. And just even we'll be coming to that shortly. And before you give us details of, because the latest pictures of President Lungu that we saw last month were with you and having that sit down with him. But I want to understand between 2023 and before the day that he died, were there any other moments before the last pictures that we saw of you and him that you shared in conversation or in passive?
Yes, there were moments. When he came, for example, in January, when he left the country in January, I met him in January. I have images of that. I think I can tell you at the time when he arrived in the country that he was in bad shape. You could see the effect of not having received medical care for the past number of years in Zambia, when the state was blocking his decision to leave, his willingness or desire to leave the country. So I sat down with him there again for several hours, and the wife was also there. And then the second time I met him was the one that you saw in May when I went to interview him again. This time he looked very well, and it was a very different Lungu from the one who arrived in January this year. The one who was there in May was very, very familiar. He looked healthy, he looked well, and that explains why I was very surprised when I heard 2 weeks later that he had died. Because when I met Lungu, this is the May meeting, he had actually been cleared by a set of doctors to go back home, because they felt he had recovered sufficiently, but they said you should come back for review maybe after 3 or 4 months. You must understand that this is a different hospital from the one that later on operated on him. And he told me that he was reluctant to go back to Zambia just now because he feared that President Hichilema's administration would not allow him to return for review if he went back to Zambia this time around. So he felt he could stick around and then do the review and subsequently leave. And during that moment, after I met him, I discovered, after speaking to the former First Lady, about what happened. He'd say, well, he got a call from the hospital, a different hospital. Remember, he had that condition that I had troubled him for some time. And he was requested, he went there on a Thursday to the hospital, and they said there was the tube was narrowing, and they needed to perform a small surgery on him. And that was the Thursday. He said, "Oh, I'm ready." But in fact, they were walking there. He was fine. And then they said Saturday as the date for the small surgery operation. On Saturday, they went there at around 7:30. The operation started, and there were 4 doctors because it was scheduled to take place on Saturday, and it went on for about 7 hours. It finished around 2:15, after which he was wheeled to the ward where he was fine. He continued talking with the former first lady and the nurses. And then the following day, which was a Sunday, they said he had developed an infection, chest infection in the lungs, a bacterial infection. That's what the hospital authorities said. And that bacterial infection could come from 2 sources. One is if you visit somebody in the hospital and you are infected, you could pass it on. But because nobody had visited Lungu within that limited time that he had been in theater and out, it couldn't be the case that it came from there. So nobody knows where that came from. It could be that maybe the equipment was unsterilized or something else. I've seen some people suggesting if this was an elimination, then it could have been put there during the operation itself. We don't know. The key issue is that bacteria caused considerable difficulties for him. And Monday came, Tuesday they gave him some antibiotics, Wednesday he had difficulty in the breathing, and Thursday he died. I don't know what the cause of death is. I've seen people saying Lungu died because of a botched-up operation. It's not true. The operation was concluded successfully. What happened next is that bacteria that infected him. Now, you see, I don't know much about bacteria. So what I did when I had the opportunity was to have a chat with Professor Nkandulua, because she's a microbiologist. She's one of Zambia's foremost experts in this area. And she was given this kind of information as well. So she understands. She says, look, this bacteria, first of all, there are strange things here, because when you have a scheduled operation, you don't ordinarily put it on a weekend when the staff capacity is limited. The scheduled operation, the operation that takes place on weekends are emergencies where you can't wait, for example. But on night, it was very strange that this hospital, you have to remember, it's a different hospital from the one that was treating him, and that gave him clearance to go. This was very specific to that condition around the throat that I mentioned earlier. So they gave him that appointment for Saturday, which was very odd. And then Professor Luo was also raising questions about this idea of, capacity in terms of the doctors who operated on him. There were 4 doctors. And even when the bacteria was noted, you want to get experts who deal with issues of bacteria to come and attend to that. There wasn't that evidence that was the case. In fact, the question was, why, when you are doing an operation of this kind, you want to bring all the experts together to say, what could go wrong? Can we have this kind of people so that they can attend to this person? We are talking about a high-profile person here. So I wasn't surprised for me when some people, which is typical when people die, of course, suggested they may have been foul play. We don't know that, so there can be no conclusion that can be reached there, even though suspicions are quite normal. What I found very strange was the quick reaction by the Zambian government, through the chief spokesperson, Cornelius Mwetwa, to dismiss any foul play. This is not a Zambian hospital, so I don't understand how Cornelius arrived at the conclusion that there was no foul play without any investigation, and for a hospital which is outside the Zambian jurisdiction. What I thought would have been more helpful, if you are really interested in protecting citizens, is to understand how did this person die, what can we do to make sure that we establish that there was no foul play, for example, rather than to simply be quick to dismiss any suspicions, for example, because it's a high-profile person that we're talking about here. And I think it's a culture that is creeping in. So when Levy died in France, we didn't raise many questions. Levy collapsed in Egypt, for example. He was taken to France. Zambia and France have no history of relating when it comes to medical tourism, for example. You'd expect that Levy's doctor was in the UK. You would have expected that maybe he should have flown to the UK, but he ended up in France in a military hospital for that matter. And he came back and he died and he came back home. Nobody raised concern to say, how did Levy die? What really happened? Can we have an investigation, if only for purposes of closure or understanding what could have been prevented, what we could have done differently? Nothing. We just took it for granted. It's okay for presidents to die outside the country. And now we had former President Sata. He died outside the country as well. There were evidence that Sata was ailing even before he left the country. What lessons do we draw from there? Very little, if any. And then you had Lungu, who dies in a hospital, and in circumstances that cannot be said to be entirely clear. You have people, I saw the UPND supporters taking to social media to simply start up this thing of saying he died during a post-operation. Or others even said he was in the ICU or he was in a hospital. On both occasions that I met Lungu during his stay here, he wasn't in the hospital. And yet there was this propaganda deliberately peddled by supporters of the establishment that he was in the ICU. And as you saw in the pictures when we met him, he wasn't. He was fine. But the key point is that the government would have handled this better if it was really looking at this without political lens. So he is a permanent Zambian, a citizen who has died outside the country. Is there anything that we can do with the family to make sure that there's closure? It's normal in the African sense when somebody dies, we believe maybe it's not a natural death. It's even possible that Lungu died in a normal way without any foul play at all. The only way you can establish that is to put a thorough investigation and establish what really happened. And on the basis of this, investigation, you could then dismiss any speculation to the effect that there was foul play. But when you have a government spokesperson standing up, somebody without any medical knowledge, saying there's no foul play, it really makes you wonder to say, what's going on here?
Perhaps from the side of government, the reason for why they were dismissing, any form of foul play involved was because perhaps they wanted to be sensitive to the moments that we're in and not really break our diplomatic ties with the country that he died in, because, like you rightly said, he died in South Africa, and if we are stating that perhaps there's potential foul play being played, then we are saying the South African government could have potentially eliminated him. So don't you think perhaps government was trying to be sensitive in this moment that the country is in, that perhaps let this thing pass and then we can begin our investigations properly?
The difference, Andrew, between making a declaration, a conclusion, and making a statement that shows sensitivity to the moment. You could say, for example, any conclusions about suspicion should be avoided in the absence of clear evidence to that effect. We understand how people feel in this moment. It's natural for Africans when we die, we think there is no death that is natural, either there's foul play or there's superstition. But as government, we want to urge citizens to desist from making any conclusions that could impair our relations with South Africa. They looked after former President well, or that could undermine the hospital's standing. That is different from saying there was no foul play involved. When you say there's no foul play involved, you are making a determination. Based on what? Where is the investigation that led you to that conclusion? Conclusions are less important compared to how you reach them. So if Cornelius Mwetwa, and you should notice that Cornelius Mwetwa is a government spokesperson. So whatever he says means it has been agreed by the entire establishment. So go and say this. There's no foul play involved here. The people are entitled to ask, what is the source of evidence? When did you carry out the investigation, for example, to make this kind of determination? I understand the need for sensitivities. And you could make that point as a government spokesperson without any conclusion. The moment you start making those conclusive remarks to say there was no foul play, you are not different from the one who is saying there was foul play. Both of you don't have a basis on which you are standing. You could say, people would say, well, but where is the evidence? How did you reach there? If somebody says Lungu there was foul play in his death, for example, we are entitled to demand evidence to say, okay, if there was foul play, where is the evidence? Can you show us? It is incumbent upon that person then to persuade us to actually see what they see, and then you can learn what they know. The same way, the government should not say there is no foul play here. Again, we can ask, how did you know that there's no foul play here? Because it's actually in the interest of everybody, whether government, whether the PF, family, anybody, to say, once this investigation, independent investigation is carried out and it produces the results that are credible based on the team that carried it, we can put the matter to bed and cut out.
You mentioned, Doc, you mentioned, Doc, that the last conversation that you had with President Edgar Lungu, he was well, and he was declared fit even to travel back to to Zambia, but he shared with you that he couldn't travel because of the fears that he had that he could be stopped from going back to South Africa. Did he share with you the type of relationship that he shared with his friend back here home on possibly why he could potentially be stopped from flying back into South Africa? Did he share with you?
He mentioned, I mean, some of this information is already in public domain, but he also highlighted a number of issues. He mentioned that in 2022, he requested the Zambian government to travel abroad. The former president's Benefits Act gives him a number of entitlements. So after he left office in 2021, Lungu retired, as you know, from politics in August that year. And that meant that the law governing the benefits of former presidents applied to him. The government started implementing that law. It meant that he was entitled to 80% of an incumbent's salary. It meant that he was entitled to medical insurance. It also meant that he was entitled to an annual air ticket, a return ticket to a country of his choice together with his spouse. So he mentioned that in 2022, he approached the government and provided even documented evidence. It was part of my research as well to that effect. And the government responded. So he showed me the letters, both the one that he sent and the response from the government. The government responded by saying they didn't have money at the time in 2022. He renewed that request for travel and medical to seek medical review in South Africa in August 2023. And then the government responded, I think on 7th September. I have the letters, I have to look at that. This time they also said your request to travel has been denied. But unlike in the first instance where they said there was no money, this time around they did not provide any reason for the decision that was made. and you see that is very important because when you reach a certain age, Andrew, it's important to have this kind of annual medical checkups, especially for people like him who was above 60, for example, and who had particular health conditions even when he was president. So when you are blocking somebody from living and from enjoying the benefits, it's not just the law that you are violating; it's also his right to travel, freedom of movement. You could see that really frustrated him because he spoke about it with pain. And it was on account of that, as well as the decision by the interim administration to use surrogates to take control of the PF, as we saw on Independence Day in 2023, where the state, the police, and the NBC conspired to facilitate the taking of the PF through their surrogates. That Lungu then came back to active politics on 28 October 2023. The government, of course, responded by stripping of his legal benefits because they said, look, you can't have a scenario where you are active in politics and you are enjoying these benefits. But what we saw also subsequent to that was a number of responses from the government. A number of his family members were arrested on all manner of charges. And then you had in 2024, you had that court case against him, which effectively stripped him of his right to seek election again in future. Now, we all know that there were problems with that case, both in relation to how it went, how the judges were, those who were appointed by Lungu were kicked out by Ichilema just before the case started, and in relation to how the case was brought up. You see, if you look at the Constitution, it says you should be able to disqualify somebody, say you are not eligible to stand for this position only after the filing of nominations, because it's at that point that you declare that this person has shown interest to seek this elected position, and because the Electoral Commission has accepted their nomination, I'm going to court to make sure that their nomination is not valid. It didn't happen. Lungu that case was taken to court prematurely, and the court, rather than dismissing it, had it undetermined. What stops me from standing up today and saying, can you disqualify Andrew from running for election in the future? On what basis, when Andrew has not told me that he intends to stand for presidency by filing nomination? It's the only confirmation. But that said, that's how Lungu was treated. And he tried to go to North Korea, rather South Korea as well, for peace conference. He was hounded out of the plane. He had his luggage removed, and he couldn't travel. That kind of treatment, I think, created very bad blood between him and his successor, to the extent that when he was here and they were told you can go back home and come back after a couple of months for review, it was understandable that he was reluctant to leave, because even the way he found himself here, he mentioned, he said, look, we had to get the ticket 30 minutes before the plane landed. And we needed to make sure that we waited until the UN rapporteur, Irene Khan, was arriving. We took advantage of that confusion, sneak into the airport, jump onto the plane, and leave. The person who helped Lungu leave, who facilitated his exit, that airport manager, Kasonde, I've forgotten his first name, was dismissed, and that matter is in court because he sued the state. Now, if later on you turn around and say, we want Lungu, we care for Lungu, it's hypocrisy, because the way he was treated when he was former president after 2021 leaves a lot to be desired. Now, I'm not saying that he himself treated Ichilema well. We will talk about that in terms of his legacy. I'm talking about the reason why he was reluctant to return home, because there was this track record of government preventing Lungu from leaving the country, even before he came back returned to active politics in October 2023. Why would you stop someone from going to seek medical treatment unless you wish to see them dead? Because it's first of all, it's a legal entitlement. It says you have medical insurance. It says you have an annual return ticket, you and your wife. You can go to any country of your choice. If you go to the government and say, I want to travel to South Africa now, the government is going to facilitate that, not to say you don't have money, for example, because it's a legal issue. But those things were violated. And it's understandable, therefore, that when he was given the opportunity to say you can go back, he was reluctant to get the opportunity so that he could just clear the review after it's done and maybe come back home, secure in the knowledge that even if he's blocked from leaving the country, at least he doesn't.
We've heard so many people describe President Hakainde Hichilema to be a very good man. One of them is Winter Kabimba. He mentions that he didn't know that President Hakainde Hichilema would turn out to be the way he's turned out. He thought that the first time he's going to be in the office, he was going to mistreat President Edgar Lungu, but that was not the case. In fact, this morning, President Hakainde Hichilema at State House did meet the UCZ executive team, who he makes mentions to them that former President Edgar Lungu is the only head of state who died with his immunity intact. Don't you think President Hakainde Hichilema, has played a part to ensure that he didn't mistreat his friend even when he left politics?
Andrew, I think if you ask many Zambians will tell you that they believe Lungu ran a very corrupt administration. There was a lot of corruption that happened under the Lungu years. If he, and even the UPND themselves sustain that narrative that the PF was a corrupt regime, for example. And you could even provide evidence in support of that assertion. So after he leaves office, the responsibility of the state, headed by Hichilema, was to facilitate the lifting of Lungu's immunity so that he could prove his innocence in court, if they believe that he was corrupt, for example. You can't go around saying this man ran a corrupt administration, and on the other hand, refusing to lift his immunity. Lungu at one time, I remember, I think it was actually a headline in the Daily Nation. He came out and said, if you think I was corrupt, lift my immunity. So it can't be that we have to say we are grateful to Hichilema for not lifting Lungu's immunity because in his interest is Hichilema acting. If public interest is such that they believe Lungu was corrupt and they should be prosecuted for corruption, the responsibility of a responsible leader is not to shield anyone from prosecution. It's to go to parliament and provide it for in the law and make the case why you believe Lungu's immunity should be lifted. Whether or not you are the majority in parliament was immaterial. What matters is you make your case. Zambians were able to say that MP voted against this motion, even when the government made it clear and provided prima facie evidence of Lungu's corruption that would have enabled him to stand trial. So when you hear people saying, Hichilema treated Lungu well because he didn't lift his immunity, for example, it presupposes that the lifting of immunity is not something that is driven by data or by evidence of wrongdoing when the leader was in power. It is at the discretion of an incumbent. It shouldn't be, because that is wrong. You are abusing your power if you are shielding an individual from prosecution on the basis of your relationship with him. What is important here is to say, if you actually genuinely believe that Lungu stole and was corrupt, the correct thing to do is to lift his immunity so that he will stand trial. Now, there's a possibility that Lungu's immunity may not have lifted because the UPND lacked two-thirds majority. But that was beside the point. What was important on the part of the government would have been to go there, make your case, genuinely believing that this man was corrupt and he had the evidence, and leave the rest of what happens next to the MPs. I have difficulties taking this idea that because Hichilema didn't facilitate the lifting of Lungu's immunity, then he was a good person. Good leaders are those who adhere to the law and the constitution, the rule of law, making sure that they don't depart from this from these rules, to compare to those who use their personal feelings about something to make determinations on matters of public interest.
Another issue that is of great importance, we've been in a period of mourning for a very long time back here in Zambia, Dr. Sishua, and this that seems to be a standoff between the family and government in terms of the the repatriation of President Lungu's remains and subsequent burial. Now we are told that President Edgar Lungu is going to be buried there in South Africa tomorrow. What is your position of President Lungu being buried in a foreign land when he was never in exile, and just how does that sit well with our culture as a country?
Andrew, the reason why Lungu is being buried in exile or in a foreign country is because of the failure of leadership on the part of President Hichilema. I know that UPND supporters don't like hearing this truth, but I will demonstrate why that is the case. To understand how we got here in terms of the standoff, it's important to go back to the history. The problem started in 2016. The election happens. Lungu wins the election by less than 2% ahead of Hichilema. And the HH, quite rightly so, feels aggrieved that the election was stolen from him. So he goes to court, the Constitutional Court, which itself was a recent creation, I think, created in 2016 as well. It was probably 6 or 7 months old. There was criticism of that court at the time it was constituted in terms of the individual judges who ended up there. Critics, led by Johnson, said these people don't even meet the qualifications for serving on this court. But it was ignored. Some of them were Lungu's former classmates at the Zambia Law School. And Hichilema took the petition before that team, whose independence was questionable. There were 5 judges. They sat and they had a number of preliminary issues to hear. By the time they were done with preliminary issues, the 14 days which is provided for in the law had elapsed. It was a Friday. And they unanimously make a decision to say, we are going to continue with this petition on Monday next week. But come Monday, they flipped and said, we can't continue because the time has lapsed. 3 judges said, we can continue. 2 judges disagreed with that, as Margaret Narula and Hilda Chiwombo. Now, there are question marks there to say, who complained over the weekend to say you should vacate your decision that you made on Friday? Because you're not sitting over the weekend, for example. And how is it possible that a unanimous decision is reversed by 3-2 a majority decision? The key issue is that the decision to throw out the petition when technicality meant that we didn't have closure to Lungu's election, because the Constitution provided that the Constitutional Court should determine at the end of the properly filed petition, which in the case of Chidema, it was properly filed, to say this man was duly elected, meaning Lungu, or he was not duly elected and therefore you're going to have another election. They didn't make any such pronouncements. But Lungu became president. Hichilema felt that he was an illegitimate leader and therefore refused to recognize his presidency. And that refusal on the part of HH got to Lungu's head, because you could see how troubled he was by the failure by the main opposition to recognize his presidency. The arrest of Hichilema over the Mungu fiasco, the Komboka fiasco in April 2017, was part of that contestation between the two, because there were question marks around the way the presidential route lining was done. But when they noticed that President Lungu was coming, they could have left the road and paved way for the president to pass. They didn't do that. I sometimes actually think that if the roles were reversed today, an opposition that does to Hichilema what Hichilema did to Lungu, they'll probably be shot dead. But the key issue is that episode, the arrest, for example, the treason arrest, for example, was very, very important to understanding the beginning of this conflict, because it was basically abuse of power on the part of Lungu. He kept Hichilema for 4 months in detention, and he was badly treated. You don't do that to a fellow human being just to show that you're president, and therefore this person must recognize you as president. It was total abuse of power and a senseless arrest. But he kept him in detention for 4 months. When he came out, I would say actually that Zambians warmed up to Hichilema, because Zambians hate leaders who abuse power to fix powerless individuals, would be it opposition. And they warmed up to HH, and as we saw in the last election, HH won, defeated Lungu. After he won, that's when you had these instances where Lungu wanted to leave the country for medical treatment. Even before he came back out in politics, the government blocked him, twice. And then they blocked him from travel. There were other mistreatment. For example, when he wants to go to church, when there's when he went to the Catholic Church in Lusaka, there were limitations on his rights, so to speak. So he was badly treated by Hichilema, the same way Hichilema was badly treated by Lungu. But you see, what we expected after Hichilema won power was not this spirit of vengeance, because Hichilema liked talking about this idea that he was kept in detention for 4 months. And it's true, and he was badly treated, and Lungu must be condemned for that. But what does Hichilema do after he comes to power? He does the same thing to Mumbupiri. Mumbupiri was kept in detention for 1 year over a non-bailable charge, after which then they said, oh, you can come out of this detention because we are going to annul it. You don't repeat what was done to you, which is wrong, and then you keep highlighting that what was done to you was bad. But what you are doing to your colleagues, your opponents, for example, is not talked about. The key issue is that bad blood between Edgar and Hichilema, which started when Edgar was president, continued even after Hichilema won power, and resulted in the frustration of Lungu coming to South Africa for medical treatment. So when he found his way here, cases of private resources, and in the most unusual circumstances, the right thing, I think, is what the family did, which is to say, we want to, after he died, that we want him to come back the same way he came to South Africa, because anything else would be hypocrisy. Why would you extend rights or benefits to Lungu that you didn't extend to him when he lived? But the key point is that at some point, they came together because they sent Haimbe at one time, the first, and then they sent wrong people like Leslie Mbola and Kabinde, who spent much over the last few months and years attacking Lungu. How do you even choose those kind of people to go and represent you at the face of the government? It's hypocrisy. But in the end, they came together. Family said, before Lungu died, he said he doesn't want Hichilema to preside over his funeral were he to die. Now, it's not for me or anybody else to start saying that's what you are saying is not true. The families are the ones Lungu spent time. Whether it's true or not is material. What matters is that they have stated their commitment. We don't want this person to be there. Why would I force myself on a funeral where people have told me we don't want you? So there are discussions between the family and the government led by Patrick Kangwa. They reached a deal, as we saw, where they said on Wednesday, 18th June, the body will be taken to Zambia. Then on arrival, there will be military honors at the airport, after which it will be taken to Chifema, Lungu's residence. Then on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, it will be taken to Mulungushi International Conference Center from 9 to 16 hours for body viewing by members of the public. But at the end of each day, it will be taken back to Lungu's residence. Then on Sunday, there will be a state funeral presided over by HH. Again, showing that the family was compromised there to say we don't mind him presiding over a state funeral on the Sunday because there will be dignitaries who are coming. So the body will be taken to Mulungushi again, after which it will be taken back to Chifema. On Monday, there was going to be a very ridiculous ceremony at the Supreme Court because he was a lawyer, followed by church service to be presided over by Archbishop Alec Banda at the showgrounds in Lusaka, then burial. That agreement was struck. They went ahead and agreed. I was very uncomfortable myself with that agreement because what you had were like two groups, each reading what they believed was the agreement. Makebi Zulu read what he thought was the agreement. Patrick Kangwa read what he thought was the agreement, but nonetheless, the spirit of the agreement was respected, and they went ahead and proceeded to make sure that the body was to be repatriated to Zambia. Then come Wednesday, just over the day before, what you saw was the Road Development Agency saying there are going to be roadworks on the road that is leading to Lungu's residence, for example. And the family complained, what is this? Because if you are going to have these roadworks for 1 week, it means this road is going to be closed. It would affect our agreement to say the body will be taken back to Lungu's residence every day throughout the period of funeral. The government stepped back and said, okay, we are going to postpone the roadworks to a week after the funeral. Then on the day of flying itself, things changed. The government programs came out and made three changes which were not agreed with the Lungu family. First, they said on arrival at the airport, the body will be received by President Hichilema at the presidential pavilion, and it will be taken to some unknown place within the airport for a small church service. The family didn't agree to this. Nobody told them who the person presided over this church service at the airport would be, which church was going to do that. Is it UCZ? Is it Catholic? Is it SDA? There was no agreement. That decision was made unilaterally, violating the spirit of the agreement. And then it was said, you can't go to the airport unless you have received the invitation. We have lost presidents before. Michael Sata died outside the country. Legman also died outside the country. People went to the airport if they had the interest, the resources, and the time. Don't stop people by saying, oh, we are going to, it's strict by invitation. Because that was very irregular because it departed from precedent. What is it that was different this time, for example? And we saw so many policemen lined up on the streets to effect that kind of order. Then the final thing that the family complained about was this thing about body viewing. If you looked at the program, everybody was not supposed to view the body until after Hichilema had done so on Thursday. Looked at why was it so important for Hichilema to be the first person to see the body? So after they violated that agreement, the Lungu family decided they want to go into Zambia because you have betrayed our trust. You see, Andrew, it's very strange when you have a president who is told in very clear terms by the deceased's family, first, we don't want you to be present at this funeral. You insist, no, I want to be present. There's no law that gives the state power to preside over a funeral of a late president. The state is not a person. It's not an individual. It's a system. If the family says we are not comfortable with the President Hichilema, Hichilema could delegate that task to Vice President Rumango, Secretary of Cabinet, or any other state official whom the family is comfortable with, in the interest of national unity and peace, and say, listen, you are grieving, I understand you, I'll step aside. What do we lose? It's not like the funeral couldn't go ahead without him. It was in his interest actually to do so because he would have shown the respect for the grieving family. But they accommodated him nonetheless and said, okay, you can do this part. They still go ahead and violate the spirit of the agreement. That is what forced the Lungu family to say, we're not going. And you see, the South African law here and the president was on the side of the family, because when Mandela died, the Gauteng authorities, the government authorities in Gauteng, wanted him to be buried in that province. The family said, no, he told us that we want to be buried in Kunu in the Eastern Cape in his village. And the president was that the family had their way. There was an Angolan general who came in for medical review. He died in South Africa, and he was in opposition. The government said, no, we are going to get the body. The family said, no. That matter went to court, and the courts ruled that the body belongs to the family. So there's a precedence here as well, the law. And you have to understand that South Africa is not a country where, like we say in Zambia, bomber and bomber, they can get their way, they can violate the law. Here, leaders respect laws and institutions work independently from the state. So rather than going back to the Lungu family to say, we have heard your concerns, your grievances, what can we do to work with you so that at least the president can come home, former president come home and rest at home. I wanted Lungu to be buried in Zambia because I'm a patriot. I don't want him in a foreign country. But I recognize that my desires and the desires of the government or the desires of the South African government are immaterial. What matters is what the family wants. And if the family wants, then wants you to do ABCD, work with them. That didn't happen. What we saw instead when Hichilema took to the screen to address the nation was the kind of arrogance that showed that he had power when he did it, which he didn't have. In the end, what we saw was a scenario where the thing that followed next was the Minister of Foreign Affairs here went to the Lungu family, and then he more recently went to Zambia. You could see that South Africa here was very neutral in this conflict because they know this is a family matter and it's a domestic issue between Zambia and the family of President Lungu. Whatever the family decides, what South Africa was going to respect. But the Zambian government interpreted these things differently to say, no, we want our desire is for him to be buried here. Yes, that's your desire, but there's in the absence of a law that gives the state power to dictate where a president should be buried, in the absence of clear precedent that the government could enforce and say this man must be buried here, the family has the final say, especially when you take into account the fact that he died here. So you couldn't blame them in the manner they have reacted, because it was very important that all of us respect the grieving family, because they're the ones who have lost. You know, yes, we was a former president, but the people who have felt the loss directly is the family, and those are the ones whose concerns and grievances must be supported.
Do you think, Doc, this is a diplomatic blunder on the image of our country? How are heads of states from other countries really looking at us, you know, as a country that a former head of state has refused to be buried in his home country? In fact, part of the conditionalities was that he mustn't even be anywhere closer to the body of the former president. What kind of image does this, you know, put on us?
Well, it's very bad. You know, this issue has received international attention, as you know, and the people are wondering, why is Lungu being buried in a foreign country? The answer is simple: failure of leadership on the part of Hichilema. He had the chance first to demonstrate that leadership by saying, I don't care whether this is what Lungu said to you or not. I'm not going to dispute that because I wasn't there. I've heard your concerns. I'll step aside from this funeral, and you can go ahead with Vice President Rumango or anybody else. But you see, HH is not somebody who is used not getting his way. So when the family say that, he feels slighted, and he insists that the head of state must preside over this funeral. So the first opportunity was really there at the beginning, where he could have easily shown leadership by stepping aside and saying, it's not a matter of life and death. Then the next opportunity was when the family agreed, and then the government violated some of the agreements, the spirit of the agreement, by doing the thing that I highlighted here. At that point, when he addressed the nation, he could have reached out to the family and say, listen, we apologize for this thing. This is against what we agreed. What does he do? He apologized to South Africa, but without apologizing to the family. We should be able to rise above our personal considerations sometimes and say, look, let me be the bigger brother here, the bigger person. And by being bigger brother, I'm not saying Hichilema is other than Lungu, but you are showing judgment that says, in this moment, it's a moment of very, very historic significance. Let me show leadership by actually reaching out to the family and say, we have heard you, we have heard your concerns. We are very sorry as government that this happened. What can we do to make you feel better? What can we do to work with you to facilitate the transportation, the repatriation of the remains of the former president of Zambia so that he can rest at home? That didn't happen. And you can clearly see now that we are laughing stock across the world because people can understand why Zambia now has this dubious distinction of having a former president buried in a foreign country.
What sort of legacy does President Edgar Lungu leave behind?
The legacy of Lungu, because sometimes, in moments of grief like this, we often exaggerate or gloss over the failures of the person. So I think it's important briefly to highlight also the legacy of this person that Lungu that we're talking about here. And they are both good and bad things. In terms of good things, I think that there are maybe 5 points that can be said about Lungu that come to mind. The first is he advanced the agenda for promoting women to key leadership positions, relative, of course, to those before him. For the first time after Lungu came to power, we had a female chief justice. We had a female vice president. Now, these will look like minor achievements, but they are huge in a patriarchal society like Zambia, where men feel entitled to leadership positions that men, rather women, belong elsewhere. So you have to give credit to Lungu for that, because after he appointed Lungu as vice president and then running mate in 2016, what you saw were his opponents embracing that. It's almost a norm now that if a president is male, if a presidential candidate is male, the running mate should be female. And I think that Lungu can take credit for that direction, because since independence in '64, they didn't have a female chief justice, substantive chief justice, for example. And I think that he pushed the button further, and he deserves credit for that. The second achievement, I think, which defines his legacy, is the Constitution of 2016. You see, that constitution was broad-based in terms of how it was arrived at. It was bipartisan. The UPND supported that constitution amendment bill in Parliament. And I think that compared to the constitution that we have had before, what we have now is the best constitution that we have had in a long time. It cedes power away to other institutions outside the presidency. No president, let themselves lose power that way that Lungu did in 2016. And I think that the 50% plus one threshold, for example, was a very, very important thing. Zambia had wanted for a long time. If you remember, we had 50% plus one in the 1991 constitution, but Chiluba removed it in the run-up to the 1996 election. And that's why you had Lemon Awasa winning with a very small mandate of 29% in 2021. And then he felt confident enough to pass the constitution that he was working on before the 2006 election. So he said the constitution will be completed after the 2006 pause, precisely because he was very worried about that clause in case the constitution was adopted. Then Rupiah Band, as reneged on these commitments, running mate, 50% plus one, and others, election date. And the PF defeated that constitutional amendment bill in 2011 when it was taken to Parliament. And then you had Michael Sata, who promised to constitution within 90 days, and then he turned around and said, what we have now is okay. Then comes Lungu, and he delivers on what his predecessors had failed to do. That, for me, is a commendable thing. We haven't tested this constitution in many respects, and it was sad that he himself tried to change it in the run-up to the 2021 election. It had to take Zambians, it had to take the UPND and others to save him, and he consequently save his legacy, because he would have destroyed it if that Bill 10, for example, had passed. But it's to his credit that we have this, and it's very sad that now you have Hichilema trying to undermine this constitution by coming up with these useless amendments, for example, just to sustain himself in power. And talk about this in a different way. The third one, I think, is infrastructure development. you have to give credit again here to the PF, starting with Michael Sata, who started this thing. And I think the resources were there. The MMD took Zambia through the hippie completion point, and then you had the debt cancellation in 2005, and the resources were freed for investment. But they also went and borrowed to invest in infrastructure, in roads, in hospitals, in schools, in bridges, especially in Lusaka, not so much in other parts of the country. There's the downside to that, of course, is the inflated cost of these infrastructure projects. And clearly, there appears to have been corruption involved. But you have to give him credit for how he continued that infrastructure development agenda. And then the other point, I think, is how he considered defeat after the 2021 election. I spoke to this earlier. It's an important norm that, that becomes part of what democratic tradition. When leaders lose power, they should peacefully concede and preside over the smooth transition of power. We know the kind of pressure he was in from his colleagues to resist that, and we don't know the kind of direction that would have taken if he had yielded some of those things. So it is to his credit that he actually accepted and left office that way. I must say quickly also on the achievement part that Lungu, for all his weaknesses, and he had many, he wasn't a liar. He was transparent even in wrongdoing. If he wanted to close the media like the Post, he would say, I'll close the Post. If he thought I didn't have a vision, he would say, I don't have a vision. Contrast that to somebody who promises heaven but delivers hell. Or if he says, guys, because he's my friend, he wasn't lying. For him, a friend is somebody he drinks with. So you couldn't say Lungu was a liar who can make promises, and then when he fails to deliver, he doesn't go back to people and say, I'm very sorry I can't do A, B, C, D for this and that reason. He just goes on with life as if he all is well, like we are seeing now with the current president. So those are the part of the achievements that I would list consider part of his legacy. On the negative side, the key one I think is the erosion of democracy under his tenure. Opposition leaders were arrested. Ichilema being a prominent example. I've spoken at great lengths how badly he treated Ichilema. That was totally unacceptable under any circumstances, and he deserves to be condemned, even in death. It was simply a show of power, mistreating your fellow opposition, keeping him. The way that Ichilema was arrested, if you remember, at night, they went to his house and destroyed so many things in the process, when they would have easily summoned him at the police, and he would have taken himself there, as he did so many times. What, of course, is also true is that even civil society were undermined. People were prevented from exercising the right to peaceful assembly. Political parties couldn't hold rallies, and I think that even the culture of human rights was seriously undermined. Amnesty International produced a report in the run-up to the last election where they detailed the climate of fear in Zambia. Lungu deserves to be condemned over that, because that's part of his legacy. We shouldn't whitewash over these things. The corruption fight also was not serious under Lungu. I'm not saying it's better now. In fact, on all these issues I'm highlighting, as his failures, Ichilema has even amplified them. But I think it's important to mention, as part of Lungu's legacy, that we saw that he wasn't dismissing corrupt officials. The FIC, the Financial Intelligence Center, constantly channeled that report that showed corruption in government, and the Auditor General, but nothing happened. Then the fourth one, I think, is national divisions. What you saw under Lungu was a scenario where you had Bembas and Easterners dominating in key positions, for example, whether it's civil service, whether it's cabinet, and that was wrong. We criticized Lungu for this because we believe the better Zambia is one where leaders try to bring us together rather than preferring one region over the other in terms of key appointment in public office, for example. He deserves to be condemned over that, and we criticize him. I wrote several things myself about the ill treatment of Tongas under Lungu. But what is disappointing, I think, for me is that what Ichilema now is doing is the reverse of that, where you are seeing Bembas and Easterners being marginalized by the same man who was crying foul when these things were happening against him. They are the kind of things that we Zambians should consistently condemn. It doesn't matter who is in power. We should be loyal to principle, not to the individuals. If Ichilema does the very wrong thing that Lungu was doing, and which you condemned him for, all of us must stand up and say, hey, not in our name, this is unacceptable. And then, of course, it also should be said that Lungu was very weak. He was a weak leader, and as a result, many people took advantage and did so many things in his name. When I met him and I asked him, why were you so slow to dismiss people who clearly were undermining public interest? He said, well, I was loyal to many of them. You see, he could see now, he said, loyalty, I think, prevented me from dismissing some of them. By the time I was doing so, I had lost the trust of the public. You are seeing some of these mistakes with each of them. For example, he is too loyal to certain people, particularly from particular region, and surrounds himself with these people. And he makes the same mistakes because these are people who want to tell you, say, Bwana, what you are doing here is unacceptable, even cabinet, they should tell him, say, hey, look at this constitutional amendment bill thing. The Oasis Forum, everybody has come together to say, can you stop this thing? What are we seeing? We are seeing a government that is intransigent in its attitude. No, we are proceeding. This is a good thing. Why? Because sometimes, people who should advise the president are too loyal to the point of weakness to this person, and vice versa. So Lungu was very loyal as well, particular people, to the point where he consequently undermined public interest or failed to act against these people because of that loyalty. Loyalty should never, override public interest. No matter how much you like the person, it's important for that person to be told very politely to say, listen, in the interest of public here, for example, I have to let you go. There are so many ministers, even under this administration, and high state officials who have been accused of high-level corruption. What have we seen? It's defense for those people. That is not wrong. That is not right. And that's exactly what constitutes part of Lungu's legacy in terms of his failures. But ultimately, I would say that, there are many lessons we can learn from Lungu. He was, in my view, a bad president and a good former president.
Prominent historian Dr. Sishiwa, thank you so much for agreeing to speak with me on this day.
Thank you so much for having me.